Hi, everybody. It's Kelly Justice here with the Philosophy Society. It's April 9th, 2024. We're in the Student Learning Center of the Toronto Metropolitan University. And today we're going to be looking at the 7 habits of highly effective people. We're going to start with the foreword and then go to the preface, which is the Inside Out chapter. In the past, I went through the book meticulously, but this time we're just going to do slides. I think it's easier. Not easier, but I don't know. Maybe it's not as boring. We'll see. There are some specific parts in the book I think that are important to look at. So maybe we will look at those. I do go over all those parts though in the slides. So I'm going to share my screen and we can start. Okay, so this is the foreword. So initially, the Jim Collins foreword, he discusses how the reason that the 7 Habits as a book is still so useful or good is because of its coherent conceptual framework. And what he kind of means by that is like how everything fits together. It fits together very, very well. And when we talk about the philosophy of science, coherence is one of the 5 properties that we use to evaluate scientific theories. So inherently, Jim Collins, the guy that wrote this foreword, is discussing that point. So that's a good thing. So the next point is this notion of timeless principles, that fundamentally Stephen Covey is like talking about leadership and what it means to be a good leader. And his fundamental thesis is that your character as a person is what makes you a good leader. And he goes through some details in the Inside Out chapter that we'll get to in a moment. And so what this does is having a solid character is will anchor certain points of yourself or a construct of yourself to give you guidance when there's things going on in your life, right? So when there's problems in the workplace or in our family or just with life in general, it's useful to have a solid character, which is what you develop over time based on principles. It's kind of the person you become. And that will help you deal with problems in the future. So in this edition of the book, on page 2 of the foreword, which is like the second page of the foreword, he says, ideas are embedded in the framework are timeless. Principles, why they work and why they speak to people in all age groups around the globe. In a world of change, disruption, chaos, and relentless uncertainty, people crave an anchor point, a set of constructs to give them guidance in the face of turbulence. And he says that Covey believed that these timeless principles do indeed exist. So I think like as a philosopher, it's important to like define our terms. We talked about that many times. And he kind of goes through a definition of principles later on in the text, but fundamentally, principle is a linguistic simplification of, in some ways, elements of nature. It's something that we would use as to guide us to not make mistakes. Because there can be principles within different disciplines, like principles of engineering or principles of mathematics. And when we follow those principles, we're not going to make certain systematic errors. So the principles of this is fundamentally on how to be effective as a person. And it instills those principles as habits so that we're effective over time. On page 3, he says, a similar pattern in personal effectiveness, first building upon a strong core of principles that are not open for continuous change, but relentless in the quest for improvement and continuous self-renewal. Dialectic enables an individual to retain a rock-solid foundation and attain sustained growth for a lifetime. So that's important. And so he goes into this notion of preserve the core and stimulate progress. So at the bottom of page 3, he says a key ingredient of leadership is beginning with character, which we said. Leadership is primarily a function of who you are, for this is the foundation for everything you do. How do you build leaders? You first build character. And then he goes into the example of Bill Gates. And so the example of Bill Gates, he kind of takes all of the habits and shows, this is again Jim Collins, shows how Bill Gates does all of these habits on page 4 and 5. I think we get to Bill Gates soon here. And yeah, and so the one thing that is important for a business is this notion of how the stimulate progress part is the audacious goal element, is that you pick goals that are beyond your current state and you strive towards them as a normative ideal. But at the same time, we have to have stability, which is this preserving of the core element. And then there's the dialectic part is kind of like a push and pull between the two. So personal effectiveness would be building upon strong core principles that are open for continuous change. And that's part of what we have within what I'm trying to do with the Philosophy Society here, is that we have certain principles that we want to be open to being reasonable about, but they're still very strong in themselves. And the goal of this is improvement and self-renewal. And then in the context of an organization, the stronger the people are, the more effective the organization will be. So the 7 habits themselves builds on an effective character, it's about building a character rather than attaining success. And then inadvertently, as you work on yourself, you'll be more successful. And then he says there's no effectiveness without discipline and no discipline without character. Leadership is essentially a function of who you are and the foundation of everything you do. Who you are is the foundation of everything you do. And that's where your leadership comes from. And he says that when we communicate to others, we want to inspire them. So the example of Bill Gates is he has this proactive response of which is habit 1. And then true discipline is channeling our best hours into first order objectives. And he gets into that into habit 3. And it's important to know how to make decisions about where you're going to invest your time. And so he says being a nonconformist, which is beginning with the end in mind, that can go back to the audacious goals thing, is that you're doing something that other people don't do. And complementing our strengths with the strengths of others, in some ways is like a win-win thing as well, is that we're looking to work with other people and cooperate with them. And that's the complementary nature, is that we want other people that have different skills than we have. And he talks about this notion of level 5 leaders, that the more effective the people are within the organization, then you'll get the emergent phenomena of the organization being stronger in itself. And these are virtues in some ways: humility, drive, and discipline. You could also call them character attributes, I guess. Virtues can be character attributes. And then you want to direct those attributes or virtues towards some other goal. And that's what he's talking about here. And part of the thing is that people can sense if you are coherent within your own character. So this notion of being the leader is to demonstrate by example. But if people don't have a sense that you're internally coherent, then it'll be difficult for them to model themselves after you. So that's where he says that a person holding power is one where their true motivations show in their decisions and actions, that they're not saying things or being a hypocrite and contradicting who they are on the inside. So the way that we do this is you build your inner character first, what you think and what you believe, and then therefore how you act, and then you're able to work with other people. So one of the main principles is private victory precedes public victory. Okay, so let's go through the Inside Out chapter. So I'm going to go back to All right. So this is the Inside Out chapter. This is basically the beginning of the book, right? So these slides were based on the 25th anniversary edition. So I wrote this. These page numbers are not going to be accurate, but I just threw it together because it was something. So these are actually, I think, more in line with what a principle is, which is very analogous to Immanuel Kant's notion of maxims, like a moral maxim, which is almost like a moral or ethical value encompassed with an action. And so these are the principles that I kind of distilled out of this chapter. So if you just want to review them really quickly, to change the situation, we got to change ourselves. That's kind of a principle. Search your own heart, and out of it flow the issues of life. Reap what you sow. Congruence with paradigms, behavior, and attitudes. To change outward attitudes and behaviors does very little good in the long run if you fail to examine the basic paradigms from which those attitudes and behaviors flow. And that's the notion of the inside out conception, that it's the way we see the world that will lead us to think, to have certain emotional predispositions or attitudes or reactions to things and the habits or behaviors that we have. And we see that in the cognitive behavioral stuff with Burns as well, right? Another one, for every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, there's one striking the root. So that's just trying to say that we want to look at the causes of the problem. 1,000-mile journey begins with the first step. These are like short little philosophical aphorisms, you know? The way we see the problem is the problem. The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. It's a quote by Einstein. Not cease from exploration. At the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we began and to know the place for the first time. So something from T.S. Eliot. So it's interesting when you read the book like more than once and you read the Eliot quote, because you've read the book and then you read it again and you're seeing those things, differently. So the book begins with him just talking about at the beginning of the Inside Out chapter. So you can follow along in yours. It'll just start at the Inside Out chapter. I'm not sure what the page numbers are. Mine starts at page 15 for Inside Out. So it's different than this one. The 25th anniversary edition has more content in the beginning than this one does. So he kind of goes through these different...
Same page.
15? Okay. He goes through people that have these problems, right? That they've gone through. So the first is like a career goal that costs the person's personal and family life. Another person talks about their diet. They can't keep promises to themselves. Another person talks about being effective with their time or their employees. They're not independent and responsible. Another one is the son is on drugs. Another one is the time one. They don't have time for themselves. Another one is trying to teach their kids the value of work. Another one is how they don't feel like they can make a difference in their life. They don't have meaning. How other people have success, but they feel that this person's like envious of their success. Another person's very forceful in their personality and get people to do things, but doesn't really know what other people think. Another person has problems with their marriage. And so all of these things are deep problems an individual can have, right? And so he goes initially into this problem that him and his wife had with one of his children. Kid was not doing well in school or in sports. In all areas of life, there was some problems, right? And so they were trying to be supportive. They were trying to, give him positive attention and stuff and see if they could reinforce him in a healthy way. But it wasn't really making a difference, right? And so at the time, Stephen Covey was working on the self-fulfilling prophecy. So we can have, the Pygmalion effect, that if we have a false belief, we can act as if that belief was true and then actually make it true. So simply because we believe something was false, it changes our behavior, but then that behavior is the thing that makes the thing true. And so it's our expectations of the world that are the problem. And so he says, we must look on page 17 at the lens through which we see the world, as well as the world we see, and that the lens itself shapes how we interpret the world. So what he's saying is that the problem with their son, in a lot of ways, was how they were looking at it as a problem. And so he went through some self-reflection, and he says, we honestly examined our deepest feelings and realized that our perception was that he was basically inadequate and somehow behind. And so he says, we needed to realize if we wanted to change the situation, we first had to change ourselves. To change ourselves effectively, we had to change our perceptions, right? So it's about, then on the slide here, a different perspective of the situation. The next one is he talks about this notion. So he's giving us this example, right, of his kid and how it was the way that they were looking at their child, and then therefore that affected how they treated their kid, right? And so now he's saying that there's this notion of something, what he calls the personality and the character ethic. And initially he was like working, I guess academically to some degree, and he was looking at all these self-help books and stuff. And he noticed that there was this, earlier, people would talk about the character ethic. They would look at specific, so he gives like a list of things. A foundation for success is like having integrity, humility, fidelity, temperance, courage, justice, patience, industry, simplicity, modesty, the golden rule. So these are like, you can find some of this information in like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, right? Like certain virtues that if we look at the world in a certain way and learn how to act with these virtues, we can develop this practical wisdom by applying these principles in our experience. And so he said the character ethic taught that these are basic principles of effective living. People can only experience true success and enduring happiness as they learn and integrate these principles into their basic character. And then he says after World War I, there was a shift in what he calls the personality ethic, which is focused on quick fixes, the way that people perceive us, not the way we really are. And he gives an example, and in the example of his son, they were initially trying to change him, right? The image of him that they saw. And then a big part of it was how people were perceiving them as parents as well, and their view of themselves. So at the bottom of page 19, he says, well, let's go up one. Our image of ourselves, our role as good, caring parents was even deeper than our image of our son, and it perhaps influenced it. We're more wrapped up in the way we were seeing and handling the problem than our concern for our own son's welfare. In the next paragraph, he says, determined to focus our efforts on us, not on our techniques, but on our deepest motives and our perception of him. Instead of trying to change him, we tried to stand apart, separate us from him, and try to sense his identity, individuality, separateness, and worth. So he says, through deep thought, we began to see our son in terms of his own uniqueness. We saw within him the layers and layers of potential that would be realized at his own pace and speed. We decided to relax and get out of his way and let his own personality emerge. We saw our natural role as being to affirm, enjoy, and value him. Conscientiously worked on our motives and cultivated internal sources of security that our own feelings of worth were not dependent on our children's acceptable behavior. The problem is so he says that the major flaw is changing outward attitudes and behaviors without changing our paradigms. So he says, stop trying to clone him into our own image or measure him against social expectations. Stop trying to kindly, positively manipulate him into an acceptable social mold. Down near the bottom of that page, our son's socially impressive accomplishments were more of a serendipitous expression of the feeling he had about himself than merely a response to a social reward. So it's important to be aware of the cause of the problems, right? And he's fundamentally saying that the way we look at the world, which is very similar to David Burns' cognitive distortion discussion, is the heart of the issue, right? And so the personality ethic is in some ways a superficial act that people will focus on, but they don't really look at the underlying issues. And so he gives examples of humans become automatons, or they engage in meaningless chatter and develop a synthetic smile. Okay, so the character ethic is the foundation of success, and that's where we give all these virtues. And then we're looking at the principles of effective living, because in some ways, living is about our habits of life. And so our character is based in our habits. That's what our character is made up of. Because it's a decision that you make, and over time, you not integrate, but you build on these habits and decisions and behaviors, and you can mold yourself into becoming a good person. So it's not about just making one mistake and then you're doomed. It's that we can be aware of ourselves and make decisions over time. We kind of direct our growth in a certain way, right? So that's letting the son grow on his own pace. And then eventually he learned constant confidence and affirmed himself. So the next section is, I'm just going to check. Okay. The next section is about primary and secondary greatness. So he says that if we use the personality ethic and what we'd say to others to do, and we don't at least make an effort in ourselves to become a good person, then you have this notion of duplicity, right? You're not coherent in yourself. And then so he says at the bottom, like near the bottom of 21, my duplicity will breed distrust in everything I do. The so-called human relations techniques will be perceived as manipulative. Makes no difference how good the rhetoric is, or even how good the intentions are. If there is little or no trust, there is little or no foundation for permanent success. Only basic goodness gives life to technique. And then on page 22 at the top, he gives this example of a farm. So if you have a farm, you can't just quickly produce fruit or whatever vegetables from the farm. There's like a natural process that goes into the farm. So this is where he gives the principle, you reap what you sow. So it's the sowing, like the farming, that is essential to produce any kind of quality product. And he says that within human relationships, it's the same thing, that natural systems are based on the law of harvest. In an artificial social system, you have to be able to, like he talks about school, you can't just like cheat school to do well. You have to like put effort into it so that you can do well, right? So he says secondary traits alone have no permanent worth in long-term relationships. There isn't deep integrity and fundamental character strength. The challenges of life will cause true motives to surface, and human relationship failure will replace short-term success. So primary greatness comes from within, and secondary greatness is how we really relate with others. And that goes to his notion of private victories, taking care of ourselves first, is more important than worrying about other people. And so at the bottom of 22, he gives this quote by William George Jordan: into the hands of every individual is given a marvelous power for good and evil, silent, unconscious, unseen influence in their life, a constant radiation of what a person really is, not what they pretend to be. So who you are as a person has to do with who you are on the inside, and not like necessarily like your reputation or what other people perceive of you. It's your actions and decisions as an individual. So now we go to the next section, which is paradigm, right? Page 23. So he says that this book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, habits are the basic and most primary element of what it means to be an effective person. It's an internalization of correct principles. Well, they can be. So we have to kind of discuss this a bit at this point, because we can have bad habits too. But the book in itself, he wants us to internalize this book, the principles within this book, so that we can have enduring happiness and success. That's what it's supposed to be based on. And so we have to understand what a paradigm is, right? And the way that he wants us to see it is that, so he says at the bottom, or the second paragraph, both the character ethic and personality ethic are examples of social paradigms. The word paradigm comes from Greek. Originally a scientific term, more commonly used today to mean model, theory, perception, assumption, or frame of reference. It is the way we see the world, not in terms of our visual sense of sight, but in terms of perceiving, understanding, and interpreting. So he says, and I have the point here on the slide, we want to see our paradigms as maps. So when we understand the notion of a map, then we can change it so that it's representative of reality. And so he gives an example: if you have the wrong map to a city, the harder you try, the more you work on your behavior, or the more you work on your attitude about the map, isn't going to change if the map is incorrect. So you might work on your behavior, you could try harder, be more diligent, double your speed. Your efforts would only succeed in you getting to the wrong place. If you work on your attitude, you can think more positively, but you still wouldn't get to the right place. Maybe you wouldn't care, but your attitude would be so positive, you'd be happy wherever you are. So if you have the right map, then your behavior, being diligent, is important. And when you encounter frustrating obstacles along the way, then your attitude can make a difference. But first and foremost, the most important requirement is the accuracy of the map. And so in terms of David Burns, it would be like having cognitions that are realistic is important, because the emotions tied to those cognitions will be representative of reality and they will help you. And if your cognitions are not healthy, then you can have negative emotions, and that's where we get like depression and stuff. So next page. Okay, so he says on the top of 24, each of us has many, many maps in our head, divided into two main categories: maps of the way things are, or realities, and maps of the way things should be, or values. So ethically, we can talk about descriptive terms, the way the world really is, or normative terms, the way the world ought to be. We interpret everything we experience through these mental maps. We seldom question their accuracy. We're usually even unaware that we have them. We simply assume that the way we see things is the way they really are, or the way they should be. Our attitudes and behaviors grow out of these assumptions. The way we see things is the source of the way we think and the way we act. So again, that's why the Philosophy Society, one of the values of being philosophical is critical thinking and making sense of things. And so not only are we applying our critical thinking to our maps, but also our behavior and our attitudes. We want to open that up, that paradigm shifting kind of a notion, to see things from different perspectives or try things out, such that we're not tied to one way of doing things, whether it's behaviorally, attitudinally, or the conceptions we have of the world. So we make sense of things, and we're healthy. So now he has this notion of the young old woman perception. So I guess I'll just like exit this really quick and just show it to the thing. All right. So if we look at this, he has the young old woman image. And so in this one, it looks like a young woman. And then, but you can still see both of them there. And this is the actual picture, right? So the first one is made to look like a younger woman. And then he says, go to page 45. This one is drawn to look like an old woman, right? So they just accentuate certain details like the nose or the jawline. This one is basically kind of neutral though. You can see both of them in there, the young and old woman. And so what he does is he gives this example of when he was in Harvard Medical School, Harvard Business School. The instructor gave out cards to both people, both sides of the class, and had them argue about it. And the purpose was to show this paradigm shift notion. Okay, so I'll go back to sharing the screen. You guys get to see how many tabs I have open for school there previously. There's like 20. Writing an essay on euthanasia. Okay, so we have this young old woman perception demonstration. And so depending on your frame of reference, like, okay, well, if you can bias it by showing one image that is more leaning towards one way of seeing it, right? But if you look at the neutral version, some people will pick out a specific detail, like they'll look at the jawline or the ear or where the eye is, and they'll see one of those images more so than the other. But usually the first one that you see, that's going to influence, that'll just be the one that you see from there on in. On page 28, he says, if 10 seconds can have that kind of impact on the way we see things, what about the conditioning of a lifetime? The influences in our lives, family, school, your religious denomination, all have made their silent unconscious impact on us and help shape our frame of reference or our paradigms, our maps. So down a little bit, next paragraph, or you skip a paragraph. The basic flaws of the personality ethic try to change outward attitudes and behaviors does very little good in the long run if we fail to examine the basic paradigms from which those attitudes and behaviors flow. Next paragraph. Each of us tends to think we can see things as they are, that we are objective. This is not the case. This is what Covey is saying. We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it. At the bottom, he says, this does not mean there are no facts. He says, both can be looking at the same identical facts, and both would acknowledge these facts. Each person's interpretation of these facts represents prior experiences, and the facts have no meaning whatsoever apart from the interpretation. The more aware we are of our basic paradigms, maps, or assumptions, the extent to which we have been influenced by our experience, the more we can take responsibility for those paradigms, examine them, test them against reality, listen to others, and be open to their perceptions, thereby getting a larger picture and a far more objective view. That's a big deal, what he just said right there, right? In that, we have being philosophical, we have the way in which Burns gets us to test our cognitions or our distorted thinking, right? And so this is very, very useful. And so going back to our slide here, there's this unconscious element of our maps or cognitions or paradigms, and we see the world through our conditioning, and we'll pick out information relative to our conditioning. And also, evolutionarily, humans have certain biases that we see things more than others, right? And then there's the last point is the bottom quote that I just said. So now we go to the notion of paradigm shift. And I've brought up Thomas Kuhn many times in class. And this is where Covey gets the idea from. So Kuhn wrote this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he's talking about how scientific breakthroughs are really a break of the old ways, breaking from the old ways of thinking. And the way that people broke those old ways of thinking is just that new students became the professors and the old professors kind of just died out, right? Because people kind of hold on to their ideas. And so paradigm shift section, the second paragraph, the term paradigm shift was introduced by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Kuhn showed how almost every significant breakthrough in the field of a scientific endeavor is first a break with tradition, old ways of thinking or old paradigms. So he gives the example of Ptolemy, the Egyptian astronomer, thought that the earth was the center of the universe, and then Copernicus had a paradigm shift, that the sun was the center of the solar system. And Newtonian physics was a specific way of looking at, how mass relates to other forms of mass. And then Einstein shifted that with his relativity paradigm. And the reason that his theory was more a better theory, and we've talked about this, is its predictive and explanatory power, right? The scope of his theory could include more information. And then we talk about germ theory, these different theories. He talks about the United States as a constitutional democracy is a different thing than the way in which a monarchy works, right? And so that's a political paradigm shift. And so on the slide here, we talk about predictive and explanatory value as we shift our different paradigms. And we went through those, germ theory, yeah. And so he gives this example. So he had a paradigm shift. He saw things differently, he felt differently, and behaved differently. And so this is a really good one that we can easily tell people. So he was on a subway in New York, right? He's just sitting there. When we've been on the subways where it's quiet. Like in the mornings, when someone starts playing music on their phone, everyone, I think, gets a little irritated, right? It's like, how are you not aware of the way we do things here? We're quiet. We're all grumpy. It's morning time, right? And this person comes in, this guy, father with kids, and the kids are being super disruptive. And the man sits down beside Stephen Covey. And Stephen Covey is trying to tolerate it, but eventually he has to say something. He's like, I just have to say something to this guy, right? Why aren't you taking care of your kids? And then the man initially says, so what does he say here? So Stephen Covey says, sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you could control them a little bit more. So he's a little irritated, right? The man lifted his gaze as if to come to consciousness of the situation for the first time. This is on page 31 of the 30th anniversary edition. And said softly, oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think. I guess they don't know how to handle it either. And so Stephen Covey is immediately blown away by this new information. He says, can you imagine what I felt in that moment? My paradigm shifted. Suddenly I saw things differently. Because I saw things differently, I thought differently, I felt differently, I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. I didn't have to worry about controlling my attitude or my behavior. My heart was filled with the man's pain, right? He's like, I'm so sorry. What can I do to help? Everything changed for him in an instant. He talks about how some people will have life-threatening situations or extreme situations where they'll have a paradigm shift. He goes back to the example of, he goes to this later, but yeah. So he says, it becomes obvious if we want to make a relatively minor change in our lives, perhaps appropriately focus on our attitudes and behaviors. We want to make significant, using the word quantum incorrectly here. That's not really what quantum is, but he just really means a big change, right? We need to work on our most basic paradigms. For every 1,000 hacking at the root of evil, leaves of evil, there's one striking at the root. Only achieve, it says quantum again, but that's kind of a psychobabble term in this thing. He just means really big. We want to make a really big improvement in our lives. As we quit hacking at the leaves of our attitudes and behaviors, we need to get to work at the root or cause of the problem, for our paradigms and our attitudes and behaviors flow. So if we don't look at the cause of the issue, the symptoms, the things we can see, they're always going to keep on coming up, and our efforts, we won't be effective because we have to keep on doing the same thing over and over again. So now he goes to this next part, okay? Being is seeing, and seeing is being. So our paradigms are inseparable from our character. He says, in order to see our son, so he goes back to the example of his kid here. In order to see our son differently, his wife and him had to be differently. Our new paradigm was created as we invested in the growth and development of our own character. So he says, paradigms are inseparable from character. Being is seeing in the human dimension. What we see is highly interrelated to what we are. We can't go very far to change our seeing without simultaneously changing our being and vice versa. So just down the last paragraph of this section, paradigms are powerful because they create the lens through which we see the world. The power of a paradigm shift is the essential power of quantum change. He uses the word quantum here. He means big, great change in our lives, whether that shift is an instantaneous or slow and deliberate process. The problem with using the word quantum here is because quantum physics has a whole bunch of phenomena, right? So one could be like, does that mean that like in an electron field, electron can appear and disappear at any point in time? And so my character will appear and disappear at any point in time. Is that what you mean by quantum? No, it doesn't mean that. In this context, the way he's like bringing our Wittgenstein friend from our Wizard Tower philosophy, the way he's using the word would just mean that it's a big change, right? But philosophically, that it's like a metaphor. Like it can be interpreted differently. Like a physicist would get irritated by him using that word. And when people use words like that in quote unquote self-help books, that's what gives self-help a bad name, because it doesn't actually mean that, right? Yeah. So anyways, okay. Next section, the principle-centered paradigm. So that's why it's important to read this, and we want to apply our critical thinking to what's going on here. And yeah, but we don't have to throw it out, right? It doesn't mean what he's saying is the meaning behind what he's saying isn't false. It's just that word specifically, we would want to just change that out, and we would actually increase the meaning of what he's trying to say. So on this slide, we have a lot going on there. So I guess I'll just go through the slide first, then I'll read. Maybe it's the best way it is. So he talks about the character ethic based on principles of human effectiveness. He goes through the naval lighthouse story. He says that principles are natural laws that cannot be broken. We only break ourselves against the laws. So like gravity. I can't change the law of gravity. I'm just going to hurt myself with gravity. Paradigms are not the territory, but the maps. Principles are the territory. Therefore, we need to have a map of the territory. This could be confusing in some ways because the territory is reality, right? And so there is a reality of the human condition. Like, for example, being proactive is based on the reality of time going forward in only one direction. And so if I do things in advance, it will help me be prepared for things in the future. But if time went in all directions for us, that wouldn't matter, right? And so I think it's important, like philosophically, there are some things to talk about with paradigms and principles. And then he talks about we want harmony with our principles that leads to survival and stability, or we can have principles that lead to disintegration and destruction. And so he says you can just test this, which is good because that goes to our falsification property when we evaluate a theory. Can we falsify it? Can we test it, right? And then he talks about examples of virtues. He gives a list here: fairness, equity, justice, integrity. He says go against those. Like if you have, and again, those are not principles. They're virtues or properties. And we can make a principle of fairness, but just one word is not enough to be a principle. I think philosophically there's problems in the way that he's representing what a principle is here. Their values, I value fairness, right? And a principle would be like, whenever I'm dealing with relations with others, I want to be fair in how I treat them. And the principle is based on the value. That makes more sense. That's more of a coherent theory. So he says principles are not practices. So this, again, is we can practice the principles. Practices are habits, but they're based on a maxim itself, right? And the maxim itself is an algorithm to success. If you do this, you will get this result. And that would be the principle, like a hypothetical syllogism. Principles are fundamental truths. They have a universal application. So that would be like how you structure the principles. So it's inclusive. So we would use deductive reasoning here if it's going to be universal, right? It's not about particular situations. It's about all things. So being proactive in general is a good value that I can apply as a principle, right? Principles are internalized into habits that empower people to deal with different situations. Principles are not values, they are the territory. So we go back to that thing again. I think there's some conceptual clarity we have to get there. We value principles, have a principle map of the principle territory, we have the truth. And then there's a reductio ad absurdum, live contrary to the principles. So if you try to go against the principles, then you just can't live, right? Okay, so let's look at the book here. So he gives, this is such a great story, right? On page 32, gives this example of the battleship or the Naval Institute, right? It's super funny. So 2 battleships are assigned to a training squadron. The lead battleship was on the watch, and as night fell, and the captain was on the bridge. Visibility was poor, and it was very foggy. The captain remained on the bridge, keeping an eye on all activities. After it was dark, the lookout on the wind of the bridge reported, "There's a light ahead of us." Is it moving, or is it like, is it staying put? It's steady, Captain. It's not moving. We're on a dangerous collision course with that ship. The captain called to the signalman, "Signal the ship. We are on a collision course. Advise you to change course 20 degrees. Back came the signal. Advisable for you to change your course 20 degrees. Captain said, "Send. I'm a captain. Change course 20 degrees. I'm a seaman, 2nd class," came the reply. "You had better change your course." The captain was furious. "Send. I'm a battleship. Change course 20 degrees. Back came the flashing light. "I'm a lighthouse." We changed course. So the paradigm shift experienced by the captain puts the situation into a totally different light. We can see a reality that is superseded by his limited perception, a reality that is critical for us to understand in our daily lives, as it was for the captain in the fog. Principles are like lighthouses. They are natural laws that cannot be broken. It's impossible for us to break the law. We can only break ourselves against the law. So yeah, it's just when we say law, what we just mean is it's a piece of language that is representative of reality, right? Like I cannot walk through the wall. You know, there's just certain things that just don't make sense. When individuals, okay, where are we here? Yeah. So he gives this example, this religious example, and the meaning of that. It's impossible for us to break the law. We can only break ourselves against the law. Individuals may look at their own lives and interactions in terms of paradigms or maps emerging out of their experience and condition. These maps are not the territory. They are a subjective reality, only attempts to describe the territory. So subjective reality is like perception. That's what we mean by that. Like, I think subjective reality is kind of an oxymoron. Reality is not subjective. Your perception of reality is subjective. The objective reality, or the territory itself, is composed of the lighthouse principles that govern human growth and happiness, natural laws that are woven into the fabric of every civilized society throughout history and comprise the roots of every family and institution that has endured and prospered. The degree to which our mental maps accurately describe the territory does not alter its existence. So we can have beliefs about the world and reality, and our beliefs have no effect on the integrity of the world and reality. We can go change stuff, like I can move the mouse, right? That's changing reality in some ways, or the world. But the content of my mind, if I believe the mouse is an elephant, it doesn't turn it into an elephant, right? The reality of such principles or natural laws becomes obvious to anyone who thinks deeply and examines the cycles of social history. So he goes through, if we have certain principles, and this is where he says, like, he gives these examples of principles, and we go against those principles, you can't survive. So these principles or natural laws are part of the human, or actually I'll go up a bit. These principles are part of most every major enduring religion, as well as the enduring social philosophies and ethical systems. They are self-evident and can easily be validated by any individual. It's as if these principles or natural laws are part of the human condition, part of human consciousness, part of the human conscience. They seem to exist in all human beings, regardless of social conditioning and loyalty to them, even though they might be submerged or numbered by such conditions or disloyalty. So he gives examples like fairness, integrity, honesty, human dignity, quality or excellence. These in some ways are like, I think we need to like expand the definition of principle a bit differently though, because it becomes a little bit conceptually skewed, the difference between principles and virtues. He says values, but it's not clear and distinct what he's trying to say about that. Anyways, the principle of potential, the idea that we are embryonic and can grow and develop and release more and more potential, develop more and more talents. So he says potential, and that's really just a placeholder for the principle. And that's not even really a principle. It's just like, it's almost like a fact, Like, is it really a principle? I think principles are guiding modes of action. If you say I'm following principles, it means that you're going to do something. And then the doing of the thing is the practice. So it's highly related to potential, is the principle of growth, the process of releasing potential and developing talents with the accompanying need for principles such as patience, nurturance, and encouragement. So here he says, principles are not practices. A practice is a specific activity or action. A practice that works in one circumstance will not necessarily work in another. So that's true, sure, but the practice is based on a principle, and it's the application of the principle in some ways. So just below that, when these truths are internalized into habits, they empower people to create a wide variety of practices to deal with different situations. He says principles are not values. Thieves can share values, but they are in violation of fundamental principles we're talking about. Okay, yeah. So in this way, he's saying that like values are open and principles are specific. He's giving a higher ordered ranking to what principle means here in contrast to value, right? Principles are the territory. Values are the maps. When we value correct principles, we have truth, a knowledge of things as they are. That might be the case, but fundamentally, both of these things are linguistic. So they will both be maps, right? Principles are guidelines for human conduct. See, this makes a bit more sense. Principles are guidelines for human conduct that are proven to have enduring permanent value. See, now to say that they're proven means that it's empirical, but I don't think it's necessarily empirical. I think that principles are a priori, that it's something that is true necessarily, independent of experience. They're essentially unarguable because they're self-evident. See, to say that they're proven, I guess that they could be a priori proven. It doesn't have to be empirical. You could say that's the way. So at the bottom, correct maps will infinitely impact our personal and interpersonal effectiveness far more than any amount of effort expended on changing our attitudes and behaviors. Okay, that's good. So next section, principles of growth and change. So he talks about the personality ethic as something that people like. It has this notion of a get-rich-quick scheme, which he does not like. He talks about how it has this illusionary and deceptive element to it. Well, let's just go through the slide here. So principles of growth and change. So he talks about the embryonic stages of growth, and he'll go through this in the next section, how our growth builds on itself. And there's sequential stages of development. No steps can be skipped. The first step of education is the admission of ignorance. So we have to know that we don't know something to learn something. That's what he's saying there. Effective relations require we listen, have emotional strength, patience, openness, and a desire to understand. Example of this friend's daughter, or sorry, no, this is an example of his daughter was being possessive on her birthday. She needed to sense possession before she could share. You can't share something you don't own, is what he's trying to say. And then he talks about this notion of this principle of there's times to teach and there's not times to teach. So on page 37, so he says, it's impossible to violate, ignore, or shortcut this developmental process. It's contrary to nature. An attempting to seek such a shortcut, I would say it's contrary to like nature and reality. Nature almost like they're basically the same thing. Attempting to seek such a shortcut only results in disappointment and frustration. So he says, 1,000-mile journey begins with the first step, can only be taken one step at a time. We have to admit that we're ignorant as the first step to learning stuff, right? Then we go to the second last paragraph on 37. To relate effectively with a wife, a husband, children, friends, or working associates, we must learn to listen. This requires emotional strength. Listening involves patience, openness, and the desire to understand. Highly developed qualities of character. Much easier to operate from low emotional level and to give high-level advice. So he says that like this public personality ethic, is deceitful to ourselves, thinking that it as a shortcut will get us what we want, right? And then he goes into the example of his daughter not sharing her toys. And he tries all these ways to persuade her that don't work. And eventually he just takes the toys from her and just gives it to the other kids. And he realizes that at that moment, so on page 39, I valid the opinion of those parents had of me more than the growth and development of my child and of our relationship together. I simply made an initial judgment that I was right. She should share. She was wrong in not doing so. I superimposed a higher level expectation on her simply because on my own scale, I was at a lower level. I was unable or unwilling to give patience or understanding, so I expected her to give things. In an attempt to compensate for my deficiency, I borrowed strength from my position and authority and forced her to do what I wanted her to do. Borrowing strength builds weakness. It builds weakness in the borrower because it reinforces dependence on external factors to get things done. It builds weakness in the person forced to acquiesce, stunting the development of independent reasoning, growth, and internal discipline. It builds weakness in the relationship. Fear replaces cooperation, and in both people involved become more arbitrary and defensive. So had I been more mature, the last paragraph in this section, I could have relied on my own intrinsic strength, my understanding of sharing and of growth, and my capacity to love and nurture, allowed my daughter to make a free choice as to whether she wanted to share or not to share. Next page. Okay, let's see here. Once children gain a sense of real possession, they share very naturally, freely, and spontaneously. That was his later reflection. So there are times to teach and times not to teach. When relationships are strained and the air charged with emotion, an attempt to teach is often perceived as a form of judgment and rejection. So that's an important principle, I would say, that if we, and that would be based on like certain values of like success and effectiveness, right? That it's important to be mindful of how we interact with people. So now the next section is the way we see the problem is the problem. So he basically goes through some of the things we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, right? The person that's trying to have his employees be effective, and he just applies this personality ethic element to it. Are you looking for a quick fix, or are you looking at your underlying character and your paradigms as the source of the issue? Talks about the person that doesn't have enough time, same thing. Is this a personality ethic way to solve the problem, or are you looking at your underlying nature or the way you see things? Issue with someone's marriage. Again, are you just blaming other people, or are you looking at how you can be a better partner? So he says, can you see on page 42 how fundamentally the paradigms of the personality ethic affect the very way we see our problems, as well as how we attempt to solve them? And so the next slide here, a new level of thinking, which is a principle-centered, character-based, inside-out approach, starting with the self, and the most inside part, our paradigms, our character, and our motives. Private victories precede public victories. We have to have this character change first within ourselves before we can expect things on the outside to change. So the inside out is a process of renewal based on natural laws governing growth and progress, an upward spiral of growth leading to progressively higher forms of responsibility. So he quotes Einstein here at the beginning of this section on page 42. The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. I'll skip a paragraph. We need a new level, a deeper level of thinking, a paradigm based on the principles that accurately describe the territory of effective human being interacting to solve these deep concerns. And that's what he thinks that the 7 Habits is, a principle-centered, character-based, inside-out approach to personal and interpersonal effectiveness. He says inside out means to start first with the self, even more fundamentally to start with the most inside part of ourselves, with our paradigms, our character, and our motives. The inside out approach, so skipping a paragraph on 43, private victories precede public victories. Making and keeping promises to ourselves precedes making and keeping promises to others. The next, inside out is a process, a continuing process of renewal based on the natural laws that govern human growth and progress. It's an upward spiral of growth that leads to progressively higher forms of responsible independence and effective interdependence. And he goes through some examples of like marriages and stuff. And then on the last page, he says, principles embodied in the 7 Habits are already deep within us, our conscious and our common sense. To recognize and develop them and to use them in meeting our deepest concerns, we need to think differently, to shift our paradigm to a new, deeper, inside-out level. And he gives this quote by T.S. Eliot. We must not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we began and to not know the place for the first time. All right, done with the slides. Okay, so we're back. All right, so that is up to page 44 of this edition of the book. The valuable parts about this chapter specifically is the paradigm shift stuff. And that's why it's like him doing that as an introduction to the book, is he's setting you up to change your paradigms. And I think that's profound in some ways. I think that it's very likely that he wrote the other parts first and tested them out and then got a lot of resistance and then reflected. I'm just making this up. I'm trying to understand in his thought process, and then reflected on his lack of success and people accepting the principles. And then he's like, I need to write like however many pages, a 30-page chapter on just this, right? On changing your view of things. And he has good examples, like the subway car example was super clear and you get it right away. And the naval base example, super clear and you get it right away, right?
Yeah.
And so the willingness of people to see things from a different perspective, like just being open to seeing things, it is a big deal, you know? And when we talk in the Philosophy Society, when we talk about what it means to be philosophical, this notion of how Stephen Covey talks about paradigm shift, which is definitely a little bit different than Thomas Kuhn, but Stephen Covey's use of paradigm shift in this context is very, very useful, right? Because we'll have certain beliefs. Like some people will believe in, Wicca or whatever, or some people will believe in like homeopathy. I always bring up homeopathy. Or some people will believe that the earth is flat, or some people believe like they have weird beliefs, like, they have certain interpretations of religion. You know what I mean? And I think it's important that we understand this concept of paradigm shift. And he goes through certain things in the upcoming chapters of centeredness. What is the thing that you use as your decision-making capacity? And being philosophical, I think, is the best, which he would say it's a principle-centered approach is the best. Being principle-centered is the way to kind of look at things. All right, so we'll see next week, and we will continue with the book, and we'll do the 7 habits and overview. So it's from page 46 to 70.